Welcome to the How We Can Heal podcast. My name is Lisa Danilchuk, and I'm a psychotherapist specializing in complex trauma treatment. I'm a graduate of UCLA and Harvard University, and I'm thrilled to share these reflections on how we can heal with you today. Today, our guest is Guy Macpherson. Guy is the creator and host of the Trauma Therapist podcast, where he and I originally connected when he invited me on to record episode 33 way back in 2014. The Trauma Therapist podcast now has over 700 episodes and thousands of loyal listeners in more than 160 countries around the world. Guy also offers online workshops and training for trauma therapists, along with podcasting workshops for mental health professionals. Guy is not only a leader in the field of trauma, connection, and growth, he's also one of the most genuine, heartfelt, and thought-provoking people you could hope to meet. He's been on the show once before, and I'm so grateful to have him back. Let's welcome Guy to the show. Guy Macpherson, welcome back to the podcast.
Lisa, thank you so much for having me back.
You're such a big part of how this podcast came to fruition, so thank you for being here and your continued support.
Appreciate that. I'm excited. A little nervous.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, who wants to listen to me talk?
I don't know, Mr. 700 and 800 episodes in. I think people are listening, Guy.
Well, listening to my guests, certainly.
And there's one continuous thread throughout all of that. I don't know what it is.
Right. Well, thanks for having me.
Brings me to my first question.
Yeah.
You have been leading a very successful podcast on trauma. I'm curious, when you first learned about trauma, how'd you get into hosting this podcast?
Well, I'll tell you, I was working at a clinic in Northern California, and right out of graduate school, we were assessing and treating young kids who were showing early signs of psychosis. I mean, that's not the first time I learned about trauma. I mean, when trauma became a thing, Jesus, I think it was, let me tell you, when I started the podcast from that experience in that clinic and we were assessing kids, one of the things we had to do was a phone intake, right? And the therapist would call, or teachers would call, or parents would call, seeing if their kid was right for the program. And I loved doing this over the phone because you had to ask questions and figure out what was going on with these kids.
Yeah.
11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old kids. And initially, as part of our protocol, you'd have to ask about trauma and you'd have to use that word.
Yeah.
Concurrent with this, I had been going through level 1 and level 2 of sensory motor psychotherapy training. So I was amped and jazzed, I had all this knowledge, right? Or some knowledge. And I was also in a consultation group with Janina Fisher.
Mm-hmm.
So I was getting all this information and I was able to use that information to be more subtle in how we asked about trauma.
Yes.
And it became more, because a lot of parents were like, well, no, never experienced any trauma, or my son's never experienced any trauma, or no, she's never been in combat or has never been raped, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And we learned to use more questions about, and talking to the kids. Have you ever felt unsafe? When were there experiences where you ever did feel unsafe? Did you ever witness any domestic violence, et cetera? No. And I was blown away by the number of people, the number of kids who experience trauma. I mean, that's not surprising, but also the number of parents who certainly didn't know, right?
Yes.
You can forgive that to a certain degree, but a lot of therapists didn't recognize that bullying could be traumatic, or witnessing to domestic violence could be traumatic, or even how to ask about that, to uncover that.
Right.
And Lisa, I got so, and then 2 weeks later or a week later, these kids would come into the office and they'd be holding their stuffy or holding their journal or holding a book. They're the kids.
Yes.
I'm like, what is going on? I got so frustrated. And I was like, what can I do? What can I do? I never started a podcast before, but at the same time, I've been commuting back and forth to this job. And I was listening to a lot of podcasts about entrepreneurs, like creating their lives, doing
Right.
their thing. And I
Yeah.
thought to myself, wouldn't it be cool if I had Janina Fisher right there next to me
Yes.
while I was driving, and I could ask her questions and she could mentor me? That's how it came about.
That's so cool. Yeah. So it's out of necessity of what you're seeing in the clinical population in front of you, what you're needing as a new-ish therapist and as an ongoing therapist. I mean, we all need ongoing support and consultation and learning. So you just dove straight in from there.
I dove straight in. And I also saw around me my fellow therapists at the time who wanted to help people, of course, but who didn't have that knowledge in trauma,
Yeah.
and consequently who were didn't feel fit to, talk to a client who was coming in who had a serious trauma background. And I was like, okay, I'll take this person. I didn't even know, I didn't know what the hell I was doing a lot of times, but I was able and willing to walk into that circle with them,
Mm-hmm.
and even though I didn't know anything, I mean, I knew a little bit, but I didn't have the experience. I was able and willing to meet them at that moment, in that trauma moment,
Yeah.
and I didn't realize the extent to which my own bullying I'd experienced as a young kid impacted and fueled this whole need almost to get into this field and to
Yeah.
help other people.
To understand it, and then to, just having a conversation with Wendy Lemke about this. We were talking about clinical hypnosis, and she was talking about that post-traumatic growth that comes and how so many therapists have been through trauma because and then they're looking and digging and trying to make good of it, right? Well, let me understand this and let me pass it on and let me support other people who are maybe in the thick of it, like you said, that moment. And they're not seeing it from this outside, clinical perspective of all the ways we break down and try to understand trauma and PTSD and treatment. Like, they're just in it.
Right.
But if you've done both of those things, you've been in it
Right.
and you've stepped out and you've sorted through and you've worked through and you've learned and you've trained and you've worked with people, then yeah, you can absolutely be someone who can at least be there with someone in it and can also reach out a helping hand and help them navigate their way through. And you think about that little kid with the stuffy, right? Like, if they can get that then in the moment and not have to wait until they're 24 and in therapy, or right, I mean, that's so valuable.
Yeah. And the thing for me, I have all this knowledge. I just got out of my program. Of course, I know what to do. Of course, this is going to, this intervention is going to help and this technique is going to help. And it was a big learning experience for me. Some things happened along the way there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can get into that whenever you want, but
I mean, I am curious because you've heard countless trauma therapists now talk about their early clinical errors. Yeah, let's hear yours.
Well, it was, this, I mean, and it's not unfamiliar. It was this idea I had of what helping was what was needed.
Yeah.
And surely this information that I had, I could utilize. I could study in page 222 of Bessel van der Kolk's book or Pat Ogden's book or Kathy Still's book. Of course, I can use that intervention when I'm seeing this client. And it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. And we had this assessment, literally it was a 40-page assessment that we had to deliver and use with these young kids to determine if they were experiencing early signs of psychosis. And we would often work with another therapist. And you try to do this in the most humane way possible, but it became very sterile. And I remember specifically this one young girl I was working with at the time, and I think she was around 14 or 15, and I was leading the assessment and leading answers, asking these questions, and it was ridiculous. She was like, yeah, no, I don't know. And I was like feeling to myself, I felt I could connect with this person, but what was happening? I took this assessment and I just like put it down on the desk And I was like, I think I took my glasses off and I was like, all right. And I just shifted, right? And I said to her, I said, let me ask you something. Let's forget this right now. What is it that your parents out there in the waiting room need to hear? Your therapist needs to hear. Because this girl, as most clients who came to that, had been to umpteen therapists and
Yes.
umpteen programs. What is it that they're not understanding, that they're not getting? It was a shift, and that whole state shift, that dynamic, and me putting that down shifted the whole tenor of the conversation. And it allowed her to open up. And it allowed me to see that, yes, I felt in my heart that I could connect and with this person. And it wasn't through that assessment, And at around the same time, my mother died unexpectedly. And that whole kind of combination of experiences really forced me to confront, what was I doing?
Yeah.
What am I doing? How am I connecting with these people? And then I had started doing the podcast and hearing from these other therapists who were sharing their experiences. And it was all, I thought it was going to be centered around, well, again, this technique and that technique, but it was their kind of early stumbling about allowing themselves to be themselves.
Yeah.
And that was a huge learning point for me. And it opened up a whole new trajectory and direction for me and my work and the podcast.
And to connect, right? I hear you really center
That's it.
The authenticity allows for the connection rather than the modality or the assessment being
totally. Yeah. And it was, for me, it was what was preventing me from that authenticity. And for me, it was this need to feel like I had an answer.
Yeah.
From a very early age, I thought I wasn't smart enough, and well, I have a degree, and of course I can know this and this and this and this and this, and it all came from a good place and an honest place, but it was misguided. And so I love this idea of allowing ourselves to be ourselves. This word authenticity we use so much, but there's so much behind that and under that and within that. And it oftentimes becomes very challenging for us to trust ourselves, to be vulnerable, to allow another person to see my flaws and my mistakes and my errors. And of course, within the clinical context, that's guided, right, by ethics and boundaries, of course.
Right.
But there's so much fire there of connection and humanness, and it's the antithesis of what someone experiences who's been traumatized interpersonally, right? They've experienced the antithesis of that. Whew.
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One of them is, have you ever had the experience then where you recognize, oh, this authenticity, this connection, this closeness is so valuable, and then the other person's not ready for that, or it doesn't feel safe for them to connect? Have you ever had that? So how would you navigate if you're saying, okay, I'm going to put the assessment down and look you straight in the eyes? And yeah, that totally works sometimes. And I think especially when we're working with children and adolescents and they're used to being in the system and they're like, blah, 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 this person doesn't care. And you put it down and you look them in the eye, or you shift your regard directly towards them in the moment and value them. They go, oh, this feels different. Like this isn't so systemic. This is actually a person in front of me. I'm wondering if you've had the experience of someone going, whoa, back up. And particularly around maybe a trauma narrative, or hey, too much too fast, or we just met and I'm not ready, and how do you navigate that in terms of this rapport and connection that we know is so valuable?
Right. Well, I think this is where experience comes in. I want to be heard clearly. I don't want to give the indication or implication that I'm saying people need to just expose themselves. Here I am,
Right.
that's not it. It's more about, and this is where experience and learning comes in for trauma therapists. I mean, knowing when to step forward and when to step back. And that requires listening and understanding
Yes.
and experience, knowing when to share, how much to share, what to share, all those things, right? But there's being able to, for lack of a better word, sense or read the person who's in front of you, and understanding again when to step into that circle with them, and be guided by their movement, their progress, right? Meeting them where they're at in that sense. But as you said, wow, this is different, and this is a different experience. It could be, to use a trauma treatment word, titrating that, right?
Yeah.
And allowing them to see that the person in front of you is not perfect, doesn't have all the answers. There are little things, right? Little things that I think therapists can do and say to test the waters. For example, even to say, I don't have all the answers. You're the expert, for example, all those things, and to see how they bounce off that person and so forth. But and a lot of people, I think, have varying degrees of thoughts on this topic. A lot of people think, well, the therapist should be the blank slate still.
Right. Yeah.
And that's whatever works for you. But for me, I don't know. I think we so value when people are share themselves, when they show their vulnerability. What does that mean? Their imperfections. I think we walk around, and a lot of therapists do, holding the therapy process like this glass ball.
Yeah.
And they're walking, and oh my God, I can't break, I can't shift it, I can't hold, and it's inevitably going to break, as opposed to this amazing hunk of clay, right? So when you're walking, it's going to get dented and marred and used, and that there's a beauty in that. And I like that analogy, because encountering someone and being willing to do that takes a certain amount of courage.
Absolutely.
For both parties.
Yeah. You can bump up against something and then bring attention to that area and intentionally reshape it, right? That's the whole repair thing. You can go, "Ooh, oops, like that wasn't my intention. That wasn't our intention. This isn't what we were expecting. And now let's work with it. Let's give it some care." Right. Okay. So maybe we just dented the edge of that. Can we give it, what do we want it to look like now? And what does it need? And those kinds of collaborative conversations, like I think a lot about a lot of the early community-based therapy I did, where I was like, oh, the ride in the car is gold, right? The basketball game, the card game, these things are gold. They're so much better than having someone come and sit in your office. Right. And I think when we're in that repair, sometimes we're in more of that parallel space of like, okay, how do we bring, and it might be really vulnerable, the thing that we're talking about, but we're also sort of working together instead of, doing an intervention.
Right. And I totally did not get that. Yeah. When I first started, I remember one of my very first experiences, I walked into my supervisor's office and I was so frustrated. And she was like, "Oh my God, what's wrong?" And I said, "They're not listening to me. They're not listening to me." And she said something I'll never forget. She calmed me down and she said, "Let me tell you something. Let me ask you something. Why do you think they need to listen to you? What makes you think they need to listen?" And I was like taken aback. I was like, "What do you mean? I went to school." And it was all not about that. And I think this is what to me makes the therapeutic process so interesting, because on the one and difficult and challenging and artful is that the therapeutic process does require a lot of knowledge. And especially when you're talking about trauma, you have to have that. And at the same time, right, there's this amazing humanness that is almost demanded in the process. And I think a lot of therapists, I've spoken with a lot of therapists, and I think I can safely say that a lot of therapy, it gets in the way.
Yeah.
They're like, whoa, I want to help. You're asking me to disclose, or I've got to work on myself. That's a whole other thing. To even get to, I remember one of my guests said, to even get to the point where you're working with someone, you've had to have done a lot of your own work. And it's not a matter of when you're going to be triggered or if you're going to be triggered, it's when. And hopefully you've done your own work so that you can deal with that. You're not dealing with your own stuff in who was, I think it was Lisa Ferenz, who said, if you're dealing with your own stuff when you're in the room with a client, you're in the wrong room.
Oh,
right? You need to be with
you
your own
need to
room.
be in your therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
that's brilliant. Yeah. So I'm curious too. You've been in this world of trauma for a long time. When did you first hear about, learn about, work with, be exposed to dissociation?
well, that's a good thing. That's a good question. I mean, I was thinking about that, and I heard about it in the school, of course, but
Oh, that's good, because not everyone says that.
well, I did. Yeah, I did
Good.
hear about it in school. And certainly, when I was in school, I'd been going through sensory motor psychotherapy training, which was really eye-opening for me. But I didn't experience dissociation until one of my internships. And it was scary. And then I'd tell you something else too. When I got divorced, I was, this is crazy. It was, I won't get too personal here, but it for me, it happened out of the blue.
Yeah.
Right. And I was like, what the hell is going on here? I remember driving in the wake of this and seeing myself out here, behind myself, looking at myself driving and thinking, okay, I'm driving and this is how, that was, I was like, wow.
It's happening to me right now.
It's happening to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was so scary.
Yeah.
It was scary.
Yeah. And even though you know about it and you've worked with it and you've done interviews about it, it's different.
Right? Oh, it's completely different.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's completely different. And I think that's a good point. It's one thing to have this knowledge, right? But it's another thing to have experienced something. Certainly, we know that. But when you experience that, like, whoa, this is crazy.
Yeah.
Am I going nuts? What is happening to me?
And just all the information. I mean, all the information that gives you of, right, there's this process and we can understand it, we can explain it, but there's also what you're describing is this meta process of how you respond to the dissociation, right? Or your experience of dissociation. What's your reaction to experiencing that? And that's a whole other layer, right? Oh my God, what is this? This is happening to me. I kind of know what this is, but it's still really scary, right? Doesn't take it away. I mean, it helps a lot of people to understand, but it doesn't take away the enormity of it.
Yeah, I was really taken aback by that whole experience. And someone said to me, it's funny because I didn't put words to it, and until was talking to someone, and I was telling them everything I was experiencing, like this kind of derealization. This what is happening to me now? Who am I?
Yeah,
I'm no longer, this I'm married. I don't have a partner. The life changed. For one, I didn't really realize, people talk about divorce and it's a traumatic thing. I didn't get that when I was married. You don't get it until you go through it. And similarly, I didn't realize that how traumatic it had been for me.
Yeah.
Well, still is pretty much.
Yeah.
And someone pointed out, Guy, you're going through trauma. And I was like,
yeah, Right. And you're like, I have interviewed almost 800 people about that. And I have all the skills and tools. And yet applying them and figuring them out and navigating through it is still very challenging. Right.
Totally, totally challenging.
Helps to have the tools versus not and to have some understanding, but it's still an experience that you navigate through day by day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the thing that excites me about this whole topic is, we talked about authenticity and vulnerability. And for me, those are crucial things and vital things for not just therapists, but for people. But I think why a lot of therapists get caught up in it is because it requires a certain amount of looking at your past, at your story, at your history, at the narrative, right? And that's not easy. That's not easy.
Oh,
But at the same time, for me, it means that, each person can value themselves, who they are, and that's okay. And in fact, that's what's almost expected in this.
I'm just thinking about, right, we just had a little knock on the door and I'm feeding my daughter now for those who aren't watching on video. She's with us. So if you hear a little cooing in the background, that's what's happening. But I also remember Megan Zippin came on the podcast season 1 and she brought her son too. And I was like, oh, you're going to have him during the interview. And then I was like, yeah, this is kind of awesome though, because this is like who you are and how you are right now. And this is your family and this is great. Bring it. Right. And he made a couple tiny noises throughout, but it's like really enriched the conversation we were having. I mean, she had been through she's been on the podcast twice too, both of you, honorary double podcasters on this podcast. But she was at the Boston Marathon finish line in 2013 when the bombs went off, and so she had really experienced a lot of PTSD and talks about, just wrote a book about a poetry book about how healing, part of it is how healing parenting has been for her, right? To like just be in the moment with the kids and just and a little bit of what you're talking about, of just that connection, right? Just that presence and connection, and how healing that has been for her as a parent who's recovering from, long-term PTSD from that event. And, she's done EMDR and all the things. And it was just like, it sounded like a dream, but it didn't work in the way that I wanted it to. But this ongoing, being connected and caring for little humans, and she expresses it really eloquently through her poetry too. But like, that's been something that's been really valuable. So I'm curious too, if, sometimes when we talk about EMDR, and that's something we focused on this season, there's this too much, too fast factor. And I'm wondering if this is something you learned early on or have seen, or, I'm sure you've talked about on the podcast with so many different angles and interviews, but is that something you experienced personally as a new clinician, just kind of diving into the modality and then going, oh, wait, we just unpacked too much?
Yeah. I mean, big time, of course. It stems from a couple of things. I mean, for me, it has stemmed from this need to have an answer.
Yeah.
To provide an answer.
Yeah.
And a need to help. Yeah. And again, I think oftentimes, in this field, we use these terms, help, heal, fix, but they really need to be defined. And I think that's a really important thing, is to understand why one gets into this field, and helping. So I remember one of my guests said to me, you have to understand that the client who's sitting in front of you has been on their healing journey long before they walked into your office.
Yeah.
And it's this, oftentimes therapists they want to help, they want to heal, they want to fix, they want to prevent other people from feeling the pain they did. Well, there has to be an understanding of, that's great for you, but it's understanding what that particular person in front of you, how do they define help?
Right.
And that's a really serious question, because a lot of damage can be done, right? If the therapist is overeager and wanting or needing
Yeah.
to, as was the case for me, needing to have the answer,
Yeah.
to fix the problem.
Right.
And
it's such a double edge because we're in this to fix the problem, right? Like that's so many of us come to understand and treat, and then we go, wait, but I don't have control over that.
I think a lot of people have differing opinions as to what the purpose is.
Yeah.
Someone said to me, your job is to be there and walk with that client through that journey. Your job is not to take away their pain.
Yes.
And I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
Really? It's there. How dare you? She said this to me. How dare you think it's your job? And she was not talking to me specifically, but rhetorically, like, how dare you think it's your job to take away their pain? This is their journey. And that's a whole other way of looking at this process. One where the therapist now becomes walking alongside the client, as opposed to this type of relationship where there is an inherent, and look, built into the therapeutic relationship, there is an inherent imbalance.
Yeah.
Clients coming to the therapist who has the knowledge, right? So it's kind of askew like that. And I think one of the jobs for the therapist is to balance that out and create this kind of environment where the therapist doesn't present him or herself as necessarily having the right answer, but allowing that client to feel like they have the answers,
And I think there are plenty of folks who want that type of authority. And I think culturally too, there's differences, right? Where some people just like, no, I want the professional and I want the authority and I want to be fixed. And that can be a challenging arc of treatment, so to speak, or of therapy to go through. I'm not going to take your pain away. I'm not,
right.
That's not my role. I'm going to go through this with you and I'm going to share the tools and we can, try these modalities and we can do these things. But that agency piece and that choice piece and that this is your life and your narrative and your choice, like coming back to that, I think it goes against sometimes larger cultures and systems that we're existing within. And so it can be a big challenge to sort of thread that through when people are coming with different expectations or hopes. And it's interesting. I mean, I think there are circumstances where someone can go for a short series of EMDR therapy and feel like, oh, that took my pain away and I feel so much better. But I think the more complex we get, which we just kind of are as human beings, the more complex the trauma, the more complex the narrative, then, the less, I want to say the less realistic that is.
Yeah, well, I think you're bringing up a really key piece here, which is the piece of empowering, and someone who has been traumatized, who's experienced interpersonal trauma, that agency, as you said, that empowerment, that self-trust has been ripped away from them.
Yeah.
And to then come into a situation or an environment where there's someone saying to them, you have what? I have the answers? No, I don't. Or you can do this. No, you're empowered. No. But that piece, being able to present something to someone such that they feel empowered, that's the key piece there, and it's a new kind of relationship for a lot of people people who've experienced ongoing trauma. They've lost that self-trust. They've lost that agency, which is so cruel. I mean, to get back, my God.
Yeah. It's significant. It's life-altering, right?
It's life-altering.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about mistakes. People are bound to make mistakes in this work from every angle. Can you talk about a time you recovered from a mistake or something you learned or took away from what felt like initially maybe a big blunder?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny. I've asked people that, and they're like, "Well, I don't make any mistakes," or, you know, I mean, I think how mistakes are treated
Yeah.
is key. And in the moment, and being willing to utilize that as an opportunity for growth and introspection with a client is crucial. For me, I talked before about that time when I put down that assessment. And
Mm-hmm.
I also mentioned, the time of my mother's death. And I remember when around that time, this is kind of just a little later, I was in session with a client and they were talking about an experience they had with a relative dying. And I remember distinctly being triggered in that moment.
Yes.
And like it was a whole body thing
Mm-hmm.
where I was like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
I'm not ready to do this.
Yeah.
And I stepped back from work at that point.
Wow.
It's like
Yeah.
in that moment, I had never experienced a full body triggering like that.
But
And
you were aware of it and you listened to it,
I
which is
was,
so important,
yeah, yeah.
right?
And I had to, and it was interesting because that experience really made me reflect on not just the work of therapy, but what my role was.
Yeah.
And I think maybe each of us have slightly different roles within this or different emphases. But for me, it's being able to connect. When we say that, what does that mean?
Mm.
Share that experience, that human experience. And it's funny because in a way, I thought to myself, okay, so what's so hard about that?
Yeah.
That seems so easy, but it's not,
Yeah.
because so much of the stuff gets in our way.
And what I love about the example you just gave is it was really about you stepping back and taking care of yourself. It wasn't, let me get in here and fix this mistake. I mean, I was thinking of like, words I'll say sometimes like, well, that wasn't helpful, was it? Or, like there are moments where you can do a repair on the fly, but there's also much bigger context of, can I facilitate this right now? Can I be
Right.
with this person in their experience? And when it does initiate a full body trigger, well, then it is time to reevaluate and assess and perhaps step back and take care of yourself. Because if you just plow ahead, or if you buy into some shaming narrative that says you need to be able to do it or whatever,
Right.
that doesn't serve anyone, right? It's
Yeah.
leaving you in a trigger fest, and it's leaving the client with a therapist who's triggered all over the place. And then that kind of brings me back to that quote you mentioned earlier of like, you're in the wrong room, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So you also mentioned your own personal journey, and I'm curious what's been healing and helping you, right? We're using those words, healing and helping, and you've got all this knowledge and wisdom. You've got this amazing community. You could like call any trauma therapist throughout the world and have a conversation with them at any point in time. What's feeling most supportive for you?
You know, that that's a good question. I love having exchanges like this,
Yeah.
and talking to people who are willing to share of themselves. And I think that's what really drives me in the work I do. I mean, it's so that's healing for me.
Yeah.
Talking to people who've gone through their own trauma journey, their own healing journey, continuing to do that. Because I've asked myself, why am I continuing to do this? But I get so much
Yeah.
from that.
Yeah.
I get so much from digging into people and finding out what drives them. And it all comes down to this willingness to share one's heart, one's soul, without the BS filters, getting that out and just allowing ourselves to have a conversation where we're willing to expose ourselves to a certain degree.
Yeah.
That to me is healing. It's
Yeah.
connection.
It's truth too. There's an
It's
element of
truth.
honesty there.
Yes,
Right.
of course.
I think there's a time and a place for, like you said, ethics and boundaries. And, if you walk into a therapist's office and the therapist starts spilling all of their things on you, like find a new therapist,
Right. Of
right?
course.
Like that's
Of
not what we're
course.
looking for. But there is like, with anything kind of extremes where you can walk into a therapist's office and feel like they're a robot. And that's, maybe the opposite of them telling you their life story.
Right.
And so in the middle somewhere, this is a human being who is navigating their lives and dealing with their own stuff as it comes up in a way that I think makes it easier to be around someone. Like if someone is dealing with and they're aware of what they're going through and are getting support and help, then it's like, oh, I can be around this person because they're not a trigger fest, or they're aware when they're a trigger fest, right? And I think that level of connection and relationship and honesty is, maybe unfortunately rare in the world that we have today. I think it's changing. People are, therapy is more normalized and people are self-reflective, and there's a lot of amazing people in the world and there's a lot of great healers in the world.
Of course. And I think, when we're talking about therapy, we have certain criteria. And when we're talking about generally speaking, how we are with the people around us, it's different too. But the commonality there is this word for me, which is humanness. And again, in the therapeutic environment, there are ethics and guidelines and boundaries, of course. But what really is healing for me, when we encounter someone, I guess not everybody, but generally speaking, I think when we encounter someone, talk to someone, see someone, hear someone who we can tell is being themselves, right? They have this sense of genuineness about them. They're exuding this sense, this sentiment. We're drawn to that.
Yeah.
We're drawn to that. I know I am, because it's kind of inviting us to say, Guy, where is that in you?
Right.
Why are you not? What are you afraid of?
Yeah.
What are you afraid of? And it's not so much, it's not just what someone else is going to think, but what we're going to think about ourselves too.
Yeah.
But to me, the excitement there is that, and I think it's exciting for therapists too, because they can be themselves. They don't have to be someone else. This idea or ideal of what a therapist needs to be.
Right.
Right.
Which just makes me think too that no one person is going to be right for everyone, and all of us just being ourselves in our own flavor allow for that unique connection of, nth degree variables that we're not aware of, and unconscious bias and all these things to play their role, and just to find somewhere where we can feel more comfort and more support and be able to have someone with us to navigate through the hard things in life.
Yeah. There's a quote by Gene Gendlin in his book, The Primacy of Human Experience, that really has inspired me and really guided the work I've been doing these last few years. And he says, the essence of working with another person is to be present as a living being. And that's lucky, because if we had to be smart or good or mature or wise, then we would probably be in trouble. But what matters is not that. What matters is to be a human being with another human being, to recognize the other person as another being in there. And I love that, because it sounds so simple.
Right.
And it is, but it's not easy to do, but it's magical and it's healing.
Yeah. I love it. And I love it because I wanted to ask you your book and your quote, like you ask all your guests. And so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So what's coming up next for you? Are you going in the direction of training more podcasters? Should Isabella sign up for your next podcast training course? She got a lot to say on the mic.
Well, it's funny you should ask. I'm starting another podcast.
Oh, Hey, tell us all about it.
I'm
You heard it here
starting
first.
I'm starting an additional podcast, and it's called Books, Read, Thrive. And it's for a more general audience, and it's about the books. So I'm going to invite on authors who've written books that help us thrive and heal and grow. So it's not just about trauma. I just want to connect more and reach out to a kind of a broader audience and have conversations about personal growth and healing and thriving.
I love it. That's
I was
amazing.
getting a lot of people on the podcast who had books and and I thought this might be a really cool thing to do. This is what I do, and I'm like, I can do this. So yeah, so I'm really excited about it, and I'm just in the planning. Well, I'm more than planning. I'm recording the trailer and getting it out there. So yeah.
Yes. Oh, I can't wait.
About that.
Are you going to keep the Trauma Therapist podcast going? Or are you going to pause? Okay.
Yeah.
You're going to keep doing that. You're adding to it. I love it.
Yeah.
Amazing. All right. I'm sure
Yeah.
people can find that, whenever they get their podcast, wherever, download
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And I've also just been thinking about where I'm going with the work I do. And I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Join the club, hey?
I should know. But yeah. But to get back to your question about what's healing, it's that thing that keeps me going.
Yeah.
That thing, that essence keeps me going.
Yeah. And is there anything else that brings you hope?
I have a real strong belief and faith in connection with people. Yeah. I think people want to connect and respond to connection, even though it can be really hard for a lot of us. That gives me a lot of hope. Yeah.
Speaking of connection, how can people best connect with you? Get on your mailing list to hear about the new podcast?
Just by going to the traumatherapistproject.com or the traumatherapistpodcast.com. They can learn about what I'm doing there.
I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming back on the show, guys.
Thank you so much for having me back. I really appreciate the work you're doing. Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. And it's great to hear from you. And I'm really looking forward to listening to your podcast and sharing that. And yeah, thanks for everything you've done. It's great to connect and, one day at a time, right? Parenting, moving through a divorce, being a human in the world, one day at a time.
Appreciate it, Lisa. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. My hope is that you walk away from these episodes feeling supported and like you have a place to come to find the hope and inspiration you need to take your next small step forward. For more information and resources, please visit my website, howwecanheal.com. There, you'll find tons of helpful resources and the full transcript of each show. You can also click the podcast menu to submit requests for upcoming topics and guests. I look forward to hearing your ideas.